what we're going to talk about actually has to do with civil rights strategy, right? And the reason why I say that and we look at it this way is because if we go back to um, whenever we think about the civil rights movement, we think about it beginning with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in, in 1954. But actually, civil rights, a movement towards civil rights, has really always been part of American culture, and particularly after Reconstruction, when Jim Crow Jim Crow laws start to be established, there's going to be a movement um, to try to bring about equality and to restore the rights of people who are what we call disenfranchised. Just so you know what that means, disenfranchised means they can't vote, right? The franchise is to vote. So to be disenfranchised means that you can't vote, which means that you're not really um, a, a part of a democracy if you can't vote, right? You're left out. Okay, so one of the things that happened during the Jim Crow era after Reconstruction was that many laws were passed to restrict the rights of blacks, to restrict their civil rights and their political rights. And so, starting as far back as the 1870s, there were movements toward trying to bring about civic equality and political rights for Black people. Okay. And among these groups was the formation of a new group called the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which is still a very powerful organization today. And they employed a strategy of litigation. So the idea being that they would sue in federal court. So, for example, um, the way that worked would be that if you came across a law that you believed to be unconstitutional, then you would get somebody to deliberately break the law so that they could be arrested and it could be tried in court, and they could appeal all the way up and eventually to the Supreme Court. And the expectation was that the federal courts would overturn the law, okay, because they were unconstitutional, most of them. You guys follow me here? Questions, comments? Okay, what happened was in one case, there was a man in Louisiana. His name was Homer Plessy. He was a light-skinned mulatto, which meant that he could pass for white. And there was a law that restricted the rights of blacks by saying that blacks had to ride in different cars on the train from whites. Okay. And so the NAACP decided to test this law, and Homer Plessy bought a ticket to ride on the white car. And then once he was on the white car, he announced that he was a Black man. Because remember the one drop rule, right? And the result was that he was arrested and tried and convicted, right, for breaking the law. But the case was appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, what the Supreme Court decided was that as long as the railroad provided equal facilities for blacks, then they were then to keep them separate was okay, was constitutional. And so this is the decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, handed down in 1896. Basically, what it says is that we consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in the act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. That's the opinion of the court. And I'd like for you to go back and read the dissent, okay, at some point. I'm not going to read it to you now, but the main thing that comes out of this is that the concept of separate but equal is now cemented in law. And what that does is it makes it Jim Crow laws much more difficult to overturn. You follow what I'm saying? Questions, comments about this? And this is the effect of separate but equal, all right? Separate but equal, you would assume both of the cars to look like this or both of the cars to look like this. But separate but equal ends up like this. And it's just not in the railroads. It's in everything, public accommodations. It's in school systems everywhere, right? The idea that they're equal facilities is a lie. That the facilities are never equal, right? And so, but because this has been endorsed in a way by the Supreme Court, this is the situation that exists for another 50 years or so, right? But you guys will recall that World War II was a sea change in the United States in the topic of civil rights, among other things. And you'll remember back 100 years ago when we started this class and you watched that movie Los Mineros. And in that movie, the Hispanics didn't start to get rights until after World War II. But after World War II, because they had participated in defending America, they insisted that they be treated equally. And so that's when we start to see them make gains in terms of civil rights. And it's the same thing with Black people. Black people, many people, Black people fought in World War II, even though the armed services were segregated. And and when they came back, there was the expectation was that they would be treated equally with whites, but of course they weren't. Okay, so there's this kind of sea change in the attitude of people that have been left out, that they won't accept this inequality any longer. And this comes to a head, I guess you could say, based on a court case that starts in Topeka, Kansas. Now, I want you guys to, at some point today, go find a map of the United States and notice where Kansas is. It's not in the South. You guys get what I'm saying? But they had segregation laws. And the law said that Black children had to go to Black schools and white children had to go to white schools, right? And of course, no white person would want to enroll their kid in a Black school. But Black people were forced often to send their kids to school farther away from home than they needed to, because there was a perfectly good white school right there in their neighborhood. And this was the case with, I can't remember the name of the guy. His name was Brown. His last name was Mr. Brown, right? But anyway, Mr. Brown had a daughter that he wanted to enroll in the public school, and they told him that he had to enroll her in a school that was farther away from where he lived than the nearest white school. So he attempted to enroll his daughter in the white school and was denied. And at that point, then he sued the Board of Education, and that worked its way up through the Supreme Court until the Supreme Court overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, basically, essentially saying, and again, you should go back and read this later, but essentially saying, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, as was every other facility that was separate, right? You guys are with me? Questions, comments? So Brown versus the Board of Education overturns the doctrine that is upholding Jim Crow. So that's the end of Jim Crow, right? Wrong. And the reason why is because even though the Supreme Court ruled that this particular law was unconstitutional, that didn't affect the thousands of other laws throughout the country that's called for or demanded separate but equal. So 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 for example, in let's say in Louisiana, or let's say in Brown versus Board of Education, Supreme Court said that the school policy that wouldn't allow Mr. Brown to enroll his daughter in the neighborhood school was unconstitutional. So that law was overturned. But the same law in Wichita, Kansas, wasn't overturned because even though it's unconstitutional, it hasn't been challenged. You follow what I'm saying? And so this sorry this strategy of the NAACP to challenge uh, segregation laws or Jim Crow laws in court is successful on an individual basis, but it's um, inefficient, ineffective, essentially in the bigger picture. Because in order to overturn all the Jim Crow laws, you'd have to challenge each one in court. And there's thousands of different laws in thousands of different jurisdictions. And so even though you may win every case, it's not possible to try so many cases that it has a significant effect.